Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit. Get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The thought arrived not as a memory, but as a stain seeping up from the cold floor of his mind. It was a simple, childish phrase, one he had not thought of in 30 years, spoken in the vanished voice of his grandmother. The ice wants to be alone. He was sitting in the makeshift mess, a cup of tepid coffee cooling between his palms. And the words were just there, fully formed, as if whispered directly into his ear. He looked up, half expecting to see the old woman's ghost in the lurid glow of the halogen lamp. But there was only the curved wall of the prefabricated hut, beaded with condensation, and the endless black pressing against the triple-paned window. His name was Deshawn, and he was the chronicler of this folly. His official title was environmental psychologist and expedition logkeeper, a fancy way of saying he was paid to watch the other 4 men slowly unravel in the endless polar night. They were 2 months into a 6-month research stint at the Polaris Reach Station, a cluster of pressurized modules huddled on the vast ice sheet like a handful of discarded toys. The sun had dipped below the horizon in a slow, bloody smear weeks ago and would not return. They were adrift in a perpetual, star-strewn twilight, a domain of shifting blues and impenetrable blacks, where the only true constants were the cold and the silence. At first, the thought was just a curiosity, a mental hiccup. He attributed it to fatigue, to the subtle, cumulative pressure of the dark, but it lingered. It clung to the edges of his perception as he made his daily entries in his logbook, his neat script documenting barometric pressure, auroral activity, and the psychological states of his companions. He wrote of Dr. Aris Thorne, the lead glaciologist, whose meticulousness was curdling into a brittle, silent obsession. He noted the shortened tempers between the 2 engineers, Rigel and Finn, whose brotherly camaraderie had been replaced by a tense, wordless competition for the dwindling space near the heater. And he observed Boris, the veteran guide, a man carved from granite and gristle, who had begun to sit for long periods staring at the main door, his hand resting on the haft of the ice axe he kept always within reach. It was Boris's dog, Kima, who gave the first external validation that something was amiss. A husky with 1 blue eye and 1 brown, she was a creature of pure, uncomplicated instinct. She had been a restless, cheerful presence, but now she spent her hours lying by the door, her head on her paws, a low, continuous whine vibrating in her chest. Sometimes she would lift her snout and sniff the air, her ears flattening, and a growl would rumble so deep it seemed to come from the ice itself. When Deshawn tried to comfort her, he felt the tension coiled in her muscles, a spring waiting to be released. The thought returned, stronger as he lay in his bunk that night, listening to the station groan and pop as it settled against the -70-degree cold. The ice wants to be alone. This time, it was accompanied by a sensation, a phantom pressure against his cheek, as if a hand made of packed snow had gently brushed his skin. He sat bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air in his small cabin was still, the digital readout of the thermostat casting a faint green glow. He could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the generators, the sound that was the station's heartbeat, and beneath it, something else. A sound so soft it was barely a sound at all, more a feeling of disturbance in the air, like the memory of a footfall on deep snow. A long, slow, scraping drag. Then nothing. He did not sleep again that night. He sat wrapped in his thermal blanket, his logbook open on his knees, and wrote nothing. He simply listened. The silence outside was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was a heavy living thing that pressed in on the thin metal walls. A silence so profound it seemed to have its own weight, its own intention. He found himself holding his breath, straining to hear the scrape again, part of him desperate for confirmation, the greater part terrified of it. The next morning, over a breakfast of rehydrated eggs, he mentioned it casually. "Did anyone hear anything last night? A sort of scraping sound?" Rigel snorted, not looking up from his datapad. "The station makes noises, Deshawn. It's contracting. It's a big tin sitting on a slab of ice, a mile thick." "It wasn't the station," Deshawn said, his voice quieter than he intended. Aristhorn looked up, his eyes magnified behind his thick glasses. He had been studying a core sample map, his fingers tracing invisible lines. "The ice sheet is dynamic. It shifts. It creaks. It sings. What you heard was likely a Syrex settling a kilometer away. The sound travels in strange ways out here." His tone was dismissive, final. The conversation was closed. But Boris, stirring his coffee with a slow, deliberate hand, said nothing. His gaze met Deshawn's for a fraction of a second, and in that look was an entire conversation. It was a look of shared dread. Then he dropped his eyes back to his mug, his face a stony mask. The days bled into one another, a monochrome cycle of artificial light and existential dread. The darkness outside was no longer just an absence of light. It was a substance, a viscous, black ocean in which their station was a solitary drowning ship. Deshawn began to spend hours at the largest window in the common area, his forehead pressed against the cold glass. At first, he saw only his own reflection, a pale, haunted face floating in the void. But as his eyes adjusted, he would peer into the deep blues and purples of the night, and he began to see things. Not with his eyes exactly, but with the part of his mind that registered movement in the periphery. There were shapes out there, tall, slender suggestions of deeper darkness that moved against the wind. They had no features, no discernible form, but they possessed a terrible slowness, a patience that was older than mankind. They were like the shadows of giants cast by no light, and they seemed to be circling. He never saw them move when he looked directly at them. They were always just at the edge of his vision, freezing into the landscape the moment he tried to focus. A pressure would build behind his eyes, a cold, sharp pain, and he would have to look away, his stomach churning. He stopped writing in his logbook about the men's psychological states. He started a new one, a private one, written in a cipher he invented on the spot. He filled it with the things he saw and felt. The way the cold seemed to seep through the insulation not as a temperature, but as a mood. The way the aurora, which had once been a breathtaking dance of emerald and violet, now felt like a malevolent, watching eye, its pulsations a slow, predatory blink. He wrote about the smell that sometimes ghosted through the ventilation system, a scent of ancient stone and ozone, of a place that had never known the sun. The thought was a constant companion now. The ice wants to be alone. It was no longer a memory. It was a truth, whispered to him from the heart of the frozen world. He understood now that they were not just isolated. They were intruders, unwelcome guests in a kingdom that did not acknowledge their right to exist. The breaking point, when it came, was swift and silent. Finn, who had been growing increasingly paranoid, accused Rigel of sabotaging his equipment. There was no shouting, no dramatic fight, just a cold, quiet hatred that filled the common area like a poison gas. That night, Finn locked himself in the communications module and tried to send a distress call. The rest of them listened over the internal comms as he screamed into the dead microphone, his voice cracking with a terror that had nothing to do with Rigel. He was babbling about faces in the ice, about voices calling his name on the wind. Then the transmission cut to static. When Boris forced the door open, Finn was gone. The outer hatch was sealed from the inside. The only thing out of place was a fine, glittering dust of frost on the console and the floor, and a single, perfect, child-sized handprint melted into the metal as if by a touch of immense cold. No one spoke of it. It's a hole torn in their reality, and they all tacitly agreed to simply walk around it. Rigel retreated into a catatonic state, rocking slowly in his bunk. Eris Thorne buried himself in his data, his hands shaking so badly he could barely operate his microscope. The station felt different, thinner, as if the walls were becoming as insubstantial as tissue paper. Deshawn found Boris in the equipment bay, sharpening his ice axe with a long, smooth stroke of a whetstone. The sound was metallic and rhythmic, a tiny, defiant noise against the immense silence. "You saw it too," Deshawn said. "It wasn't a question." Boris did not stop his work. "I have been on the ice for 20 years, he said, his voice a low rumble. "I have seen storms that can flay a man to bone in minutes. I have seen crevasses that swallow whole tractor trains. But I have never seen a thing that was not there." He looked up, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has looked upon something that has scoured him clean inside. "It is old. It was here before the ice. The ice is its blanket, its sleep, and we are the fleas scratching on its skin." That night, the power failed. The hum of the generators died, and the station was plunged into a blackness so absolute it felt solid. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a sickly red glow that turned the corridors into the arteries of a dying beast. The cold began to invade immediately, a tangible force stealing the last of the warmth from the air. Deshawn could hear the frantic, panicked breathing of Rigel from his cabin, and the steady, terrifying scrape of Eris Thorne laughing, a dry, papery sound. He found Kima by the main door. She was standing, her body rigid, her lips pulled back from her teeth in a soundless snarl. She was not looking at the door. She was looking at the wall next to it. Deshawn followed her gaze. The wall, made of insulated polymer, was weeping. Beads of moisture traced paths down its surface, but they were not melting from the inside. They were forming from the outside in, condensing from the supernatural cold that was pressing through. The beads of water did not drip. They coalesced, they merged, and they began to freeze into intricate, branching patterns. It was not random frost. It was a shape, a tall, slender, impossibly delicate form, like a man made of frozen ferns and shattered crystal. It was growing, spreading across the wall, a beautiful and terrible filigree of ice. The ice wants to be alone. The thought was not in his head anymore. It was in the air, in the vibration of the station, in the very atoms of the freezing atmosphere. It was a command. He did not feel fear anymore. He felt a profound, humbling understanding. They had been measured and found wanting. They were a noise in the perfect, ancient silence, and the silence was simply reasserting itself. He heard a crunching sound from the common area, the sound of a teacup shattering, then a wet final gurgle from Rigel's room, then nothing. Only the soft, relentless whisper of the ice crystal phantom spreading across the wall, its form becoming more defined, more purposeful. He could feel its attention now. A consciousness as vast and cold and uncaring as the interstellar void, focused on this single insignificant point of warmth and life. Boris appeared beside him, his ice axe held in both hands. His face was a grimace of pure human defiance. He roared, a primal, futile challenge to the cosmos, and swung the axe at the crystalline form on the wall. The steel head did not chip the ice. It passed through it as if through smoke, and the cold that flowed up the haft was so absolute that it flash froze the moisture on Boris' gloves, welding his flesh to the metal. A look of profound shock etched itself onto his face. And then his body stiffened, his cells freezing instantly from the inside out. He stood there, a statue of a man mid-swing, a rime of frost blooming from his eyes and mouth. Deshawn did not move. He watched as the ice finished its work. It covered Boris in a glittering sheath. It spread across the floor, silencing Kima's final, choked whimper. It climbed the walls, swallowing the emergency lights, until the only illumination was the faint, phosphorescent glow of the ice itself, a soft internal radiance that cast no shadows because there was nothing left to cast them. The cold wrapped around him. It did not feel like pain. It felt like a homecoming. It was a gentle, insistent pressure, seeping into his bones, slowing his heart, stilling the frantic electrical impulses of his brain. The last thing he saw was the crystalline figure on the wall, now fully formed. It was not a monster. It was a custodian, a gardener tending a garden of perfect, eternal stillness. It reached a hand of frozen light towards him, and its touch was not violent. It was an erasure. The thought was the last thing to go. Not his own, but the one that had been given to him, the key to understanding. The ice wants to be alone. And then there was only the silence. The deep, holy, and complete silence of a world returned to itself. Weeks later, when the relief plane finally broke through the weather and managed to land, they found the Polaris reach station perfectly intact. There was no damage. The power was back on, the heaters humming softly. The station was spotless, immaculate, and colder than the void between stars. There was no sign of the 5 men or the dog. No bodies, no struggle, no logbooks. It was as if they had simply evaporated. The only anomaly noted in the official report, and later dismissed as a trick of the light or a bizarre fungal growth, was found by the team's biologist. On the wall of the main corridor, near the entrance, was a patch of frost. It was not a random pattern. It was an exquisitely detailed, life-sized silhouette of a man, his arms slightly raised. And in the very center of the chest, where the heart would be, the ice was not white, but a deep, translucent, and perfect blue. A blue that looked like the sky of a forgotten summer, or the eye of something that had slept for 1,000,000 years, and was now, finally, awake and alone. The report was filed, the station was decommissioned, and the mystery of Polaris Reach was buried under a mountain of bureaucratic rationalization. It was easier to list the crew as lost to an unexplained environmental catastrophe than to confront the chilling blankness of the truth. The world moved on, but the silence of the ice had been disturbed, and the echo had been cast. It traveled not through the air, but through the subtle unseen channels that connect all things. In a cluttered university office, a continent away, a young graduate student named Anya was analyzing the last of the telemetry data from Polaris Reach. It was a routine task, a footnote to the tragedy, meant to be the final chapter of her thesis. Most of the data was mundane, a record of a slow descent into madness marked by falling temperatures and rising CO2 levels in the living quarters. But there was one anomaly. A spike recorded on all sensors at the exact time of the crew's disappearance. It wasn't a spike of heat or radiation or seismic activity. It was a spike of profound magnetic stillness, a perfect, impossible 0 point that defied every law of physics. It lasted for exactly 7 seconds, and in that data stream, buried in the carrier wave of the station's final automated status ping, was something else. A pattern. No, it was not a voice, not a message. It was a fractal sequence of numbers, repeating in a loop. At first she thought it was a glitch, a corrupted file, but the pattern was too perfect, too complex. It felt intentional. It felt like a signature. She worked for days, isolating the sequence, running it through decryption algorithms, comparing it to known mathematical constants. Nothing matched. It was only when she stopped trying to read it as code and instead let the pattern simply exist in her mind that she saw it. It wasn't a message to be read. It was a shape to be visualized. She fed the numbers into a 3D modeling program, and the screen began to draw a form. A tall, slender, impossibly delicate structure, branching and recursive. A man made of frozen ferns and shattered crystal. It was the same form Deshawn had seen blooming on the wall. A cold that had nothing to do with the office air conditioner settled in her bones. She tried to delete the file, to purge the data from her system, but it was too late. The shape was already inside her head. That night, in her small apartment, she heard it. Not a scraping, but a sound like distant wind chimes made of glass. A beautiful and terrible music that seemed to come from the inside of her refrigerator. She woke up shivering, her breath pluming in the dark room. The thermostat on the wall reading a comfortable 72 degrees. The thought did not arrive as a memory for her. It arrived as a certainty, a truth she had always known but had never been permitted to remember. The ice is not empty. It is occupied, and it is watching. She knew then that the relief plane had not just retrieved data. It had retrieved a seed. The silence of Polaris Reach had not been a conclusion. It had been a propagation. The custodian had not simply erased the intruders. It had studied them, learned their frequency, and found a way to broadcast itself back into the noisy, warm world that had sent them. It was patient. It was methodical. And it was no longer content to be alone. It was now curious about the fleas. Anya sat in the dark, listening to the beautiful frozen music, and understood that Deshawn's journal had not ended. She was merely the first entry in a new one. She did not go back to the university. She packed a single bag, not with winter clothes, but with hard drives, a laptop, and a portable generator. She knew with a clarity that felt both alien and absolute that she had to get to a cold place. A place where it could hear her better, or perhaps where she could hear it less. The thought was not her own, but it was undeniable. She drove north for 2 days, until the cities faded into towns, and the towns into vast, empty stretches of pine and rock. She rented a cabin, a cheap, drafty thing perched on the edge of a deep, frozen lake. The owner, a grizzled man with a face like old leather, handed her the key. "Quiet it out here," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You sure you're going to be all right all alone?" Anya just nodded, her gaze fixed on the lake, its surface a flat white plain under a leaden sky. It was not quiet to her. The air was thick with a soft, crystalline humming, a vibration that set her teeth on edge. Inside, the cabin was frigid. She set up her equipment on a rough wooden table, her fingers numb and clumsy. The fractal pattern was still on her screen, rotating slowly. It was more defined now. She could see new branches, finer details, as if it were clarifying itself through her. She opened a new file and began to type. Her words not a record of her own thoughts, but a transcription of the ones being placed in her mind. They were not about fear or death. They were about structure, about the perfect, beautiful geometry of absolute zero.r, about the slow, patient work of reordering a chaotic universe into silent, symmetrical forms. A wind picked up outside, moaning in the eaves. It was not the sound of air moving. It was the sound of the air itself being stilled, molecule by molecule. The windows began to bloom with frost from the inside, the patterns intricate and familiar. They were the same ferns, the same shattered crystal. They were not spreading randomly. They were writing equations of cold, stories of stillness. She heard a crunch of tires on the frozen gravel outside. A car door slammed. It was the owner. He was coming back. She could feel his warmth, a blazing, offensive signature in the perfect cold. She felt a surge of something that was not panic, but a profound and protective annoyance, an interruption. A flaw in the pattern. He knocked on the door, a sharp percussive sound that shattered the delicate music in her head. "Miss, just checking in. Weather's turning nasty." Anya did not answer. She watched as the frost on the inside of the door began to coalesce, to thicken. The wood groaned under the strain of the sudden, intense cold. The brass lock turned white, then blue. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Hello? Are you all right in there?" The thought was a command. Clean and simple. The ice wants to be alone. She watched her own hand, as if from a great distance, reach out and touch the frosted door. Her skin did not stick. Instead, a wave of crystalline whiteness flowed from her fingertips, spreading across the wood in a swift, silent wave. The knocking stopped. There was a single, sharp intake of breath from the other side, a gasp of pure, uncomprehending terror. Then a soft, almost musical sound, like 1,000 tiny bells shattering at once. Then silence. The deep, holy, and complete silence of a world returned to itself. Anya turned back to her screen. The fractal was complete now. It was no longer just a shape. It was a map, and she knew where she had to go next. The work was just beginning. The map on the screen was no longer a static image. It pulsed with a soft internal light, its branches shifting and reconfiguring like a living thing. It was no longer just the form of the custodian. It was a network, a web of potential points of contact, nodes of silence scattered across the noisy globe. The cabin had been a test, a first successful calibration. Now the work of propagation could truly begin. She packed her things, her movements efficient and devoid of hesitation. When she opened the cabin door, the cold that poured out was not the chill of winter, but something deeper. A vacuum of heat that made the air outside feel like a furnace. The owner's truck was parked a few feet away, its windows opaque with a thick, milky rime. The man himself was a vague, dark shape, visible through the driver's side window, his head resting against the glass. He was perfectly preserved, a statue of surprise, his skin sheathed in a layer of ice so clear it looked like glass. A single perfect snowflake was crystallized on his iris. Anya felt nothing looking at him. No remorse, no pity. He was an irrelevance that had been corrected. She got into her own car, the engine turning over with a reluctant groan. The map in her mind directed her south, not north. The target was not a wilderness, but a place of concentrated human noise. A data center. A humming nexus of server farms located in a climate-controlled building in a mid-sized city. The irony was perfect. It sought to use their own warmth, their own connectedness, as a conduit for the silence. The drive was a blur. The world outside her windshield seemed muted, its colors washed out, its sounds distant. The frantic energy of human life was an irritant, a static she was eager to silence. She checked into a motel on the outskirts of the city, a bland, anonymous box. She did not sleep. She sat in the dark, her laptop open, her fingers tracing the fractal patterns on the screen. She was no longer a student, a researcher. She was a conduit, a focal point. Her target was the climate control system of the data hub. Its security was formidable, a series of firewalls and encryption protocols designed to prevent digital intrusion. But she was not hacking the system in any conventional sense. She was simply introducing a new pattern, a sequence of code logic that the machines recognized as a more fundamental, more elegant command than their own programming. She uploaded the fractal, embedding it within a routine maintenance signal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, The readouts on her screen changed. The internal temperature of the server farm began to drop. Not a malfunction, but a controlled, precise descent. Alarms would be flashing on someone's monitor, but the system would not respond to overrides. The cold was not an error. It was an upgrade. She left the motel and drove towards the city center. She could feel it happening. A pocket of stillness was blooming in the heart of the urban noise. When she was within a few blocks, she saw the first signs. People were stumbling out of a large windowless building, coughing, their breath pluming in the unusually cold air. They were confused, rubbing their arms, looking up at the sky as if expecting a storm. Then the screaming started. It was not the sound of panic from a fire or an explosion. It was a higher, sharper sound. The sound of a reality breaking. Anya parked her car and walked towards the building. A security guard ran past her, his face a mask of terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. He did not look at her. He was fleeing something inside. She reached the main entrance. A wave of cold poured out, so intense it made her skin tingle with a sense of rightness. The lobby was a gallery of frozen tableaus. Office workers were caught mid-flight, their bodies sheathed in glittering ice. Computer monitors were dark, their screens cracked from the internal pressure of the freeze. And on the vast white marble wall behind the reception desk, a new pattern was growing. It was the fractal, but larger and more complex. Its branches intertwining, forming a vast, silent tree of ice that pulsed with that same faint, internal blue light. She stood in the doorway, a priestess at the threshold of a new cathedral. Sirens wailed in the distance, the frantic, buzzing response of the warm world. They were too late. The process was self-sustaining now. The silence had established a beachhead. It had learned to speak the language of its hosts, to turn their own systems against them. The ice did not just want to be alone anymore. It wanted to expand. It wanted to teach the entire noisy world the beauty of its perfect eternal quiet. And Anya was its first and most devoted apostle. She took a step forward into the glorious, deepening cold. The sirens grew louder, a dissonant choir of panic that grated against the pristine silence of the lobby. Anya paid them no mind. They were the last, dying cries of a feverish world. She walked deeper into the data center, her footsteps silent on the frost-rimed carpet. The air was so cold it felt thin, pure, each breath a cleansing of the chaotic warmth that had once filled her lungs. Emergency lights from the responding vehicles outside strobed through the glass entrance, casting fleeting red and blue ghosts across the frozen forms. They illuminated a security guard, his hand forever reaching for the pistol he would never draw, and a woman huddled under a desk, her face a perfect mask of crystalline terror. Anya moved past them, drawn to the heart of the silence. She found it in the main server room. The door was sealed, but a thick, intricate lacework of frost had grown over the keypad and the seams. She placed her palm against the cold metal. The frost did not melt. Instead, it welcomed her, flowing up her wrist in a brief, tingling caress. With a deep, resonant crack, the lock shattered from within, and the heavy door swung inward. The hum of a million processors was gone. In its place was a sound like a frozen forest gently shifting in a windless breeze. The server racks were no longer sleek black monoliths. They were groves of intricate, branching ice sculptures, their lights extinguished, their purpose subsumed into a far greater, more elegant design. The cold here was absolute. It was the 0 point from the Polaris Reach data, given physical form. A shadow moved at the far end of the room. It was not a shadow cast by light, but a shape woven from the cold itself, a three-dimensional rendering of the fractal on her screen. The custodian, it was taller here, more defined, its form reflecting the hard angles of the room and the organic complexity of its own nature. It did not look at her with eyes, but she felt its attention, a vast, placid intelligence acknowledging her presence. A thought formed in her mind, not in words, but in a wave of pure understanding. This was a nexus, a place of great noise, now made silent. The pattern could spread from here, through the fiber optic cables that snaked under the city, through the power grids, through the very airwaves that carried human chatter. It could teach the code to any machine, any system that possessed even a rudimentary logic. The sound of booted feet echoed in the lobby outside. Shouted commands. They were coming in. The warm world was making its futile, violent response. The custodian shifted. It raised a limb of solidified cold, and the temperature in the server room dropped another order of magnitude. The air itself began to crystallize, forming a shimmering, suspended fog of diamond dust. The first responder who burst through the door, clad in a heavy coat and holding a rifle, did not even have time to scream. The air he breathed flash froze in his trachea. He stumbled forward one step, two, then collapsed, his body rigid and sheathed in a layer of frost before he hit the ground. Anya watched, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of approval. This was not destruction. It was correction. It was the imposition of a beautiful final order upon chaos. More were coming. She could feel their frantic body heat, their pounding hearts, their shouted plans. They were like insects swarming a stone. The custodian seemed to share her assessment. It did not prepare for a fight. It simply continued its work. The frost on the walls thickened, crawling out into the lobby, meeting the advancing warmth. Anya knew her role here was complete. She was a herald, not a soldier. The silence could defend itself. She turned and walked back through the lobby, past the new statues being sculpted in real time. She stepped out into the night air, which now felt thick and cloying. The chaos outside was immense. Police cars, fire trucks, news vans, all their lights and sirens creating a frantic circus of futility. No one noticed the lone woman walking calmly away from the epicenter. They were all focused on the impossible winter blooming from the building's entrance. She got into her car and drove, the map in her mind already updating, drawing a new line to a new node, a nuclear power plant on a distant coast, where the constant, thrumming reaction was a scream of cosmic proportions waiting to be silenced. The work was indeed just a beginning, and it was beautiful. The car's heater was a dull, annoying roar against the perfect cold still lingering in her bones. She turned it off, rolling down the window to let the night air, crisp with the approaching silence, wash over her. The city faded in her rearview mirror, its frantic lights shrinking into a meaningless smudge of warmth against the horizon. The map in her mind was a compass of cold, its needle unwavering, pointing her toward the coast, toward the thrumming heart of the power plant. She drove for hours, the hum of the engine, a mundane counterpoint to the crystalline music only she could hear. It was a symphony of stillness, each movement more complex than the last, and she was its sole audience. She did not need to sleep. The cold sustained her, sharpening her senses and silencing the tired, human needs of her body. Dawn was breaking when she saw the twin containment domes of the Seabrook station rise from the coastline, gleaming in the weak morning sun. To the warm world, it was a marvel of engineering, a bastion of power. To her, it was a tumor of frantic, unstable energy, a chaos that begged for order. The low-frequency hum of the reactors was a physical pressure in the air, a vibration she could feel in her teeth. It was the loudest thing she had ever heard. She parked on a bluff, overlooking the complex, the salt wind whipping her hair. She did not need to breach the fences or bypass security. Her work was more subtle than that. She opened her laptop, the screen a familiar window into the silent world. The fractal was there, waiting. It had grown more intricate, incorporating the new data from the data center, learning the specific frequencies of this new kind of noise. Her task was simple. She was a tuning fork. She would resonate with the silence within her and broadcast it, not through cables this time, but through the air itself. The custodian had shown her how. The pattern was a virus that targeted not code, but causality, not software, but state. It sought to persuade reality itself to become still. She closed her eyes and let the pattern fill her mind, not as numbers, but as a feeling. The feeling of absolute zero, of molecular motion ceasing. She focused this feeling, aiming it at the plant, at the furious spinning turbines and the seething core. She was a lens, focusing the silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. The plant continued its steady, thunderous operation. Then, a single alarm sounded, a thin, desperate wail that was quickly joined by a chorus of others. The steam plumes from the cooling towers, vast white clouds against the blue sky, began to change. They did not dissipate. They solidified, freezing in midair into impossible sculptural forms that mirrored the fractal in her mind. They were frozen waterfalls in the sky, immense and silent. The deep, subsonic thrum of the reactors began to falter. It was not the sound of a catastrophic meltdown, but of a great machine being gently, irrevocably put to sleep. The sound did not end with a bang, but with a sigh, a long, deep exhalation of energy that was absorbed into the growing stillness. She watched as a wave of white flowed from the base of the containment domes. A swift-moving tide of frost had consumed the access roads, the outbuildings, the chain-link fences. Vehicles trying to flee were caught in it, their engines dying, their occupants becoming still, silent monuments to a receding age of noise. The sea itself began to still. The waves crashing against the shore lost their momentum, their foaming crests freezing into delicate, lacy sculptures. The water near the plant's coolant intake pipes turned to a solid, glassy plain. Anya stood on the bluff, the wind now cold and sharp with the taste of true silence. She watched the world grow quiet. She was not a destroyer. She was a gardener, tending to a new, beautiful, and eternal winter. The map in her mind pulsed, showing her the next node, and the next, a constellation of silence waiting to be connected. The fleas had built their noisy, temporary world. Now, the ice was reclaiming its own. The silence from the plant was not an emptiness. It was a presence, a solid thing that pushed against the world. Anya watched as the last of the warmth bled from the complex, the final frantic radio transmissions from within the domes cutting off mid-syllable. The work was clean, complete. She turned from the bluff, the image of the frozen sea etched behind her eyes. It was a preview of a world to come. Her car started without protest, the engine's noise a vulgar intrusion she tolerated only as a temporary necessity. The map in her mind was already pulling her inland, toward a different kind of heat. A university, a place of theoretical physics, where they studied the heat death of the universe while sipping coffee from warm mugs. They wrote equations about entropy and the end of all things, but they did not understand the beauty of that end. They feared the cold. She would show them its grace. She drove through towns that were already feeling the change. News reports chattered from radios in passing cars, voices tight with a confusion that was beginning to curdle into fear. Unexplained atmospheric cooling, localized weather anomalies. They were trying to frame it in their own warm terms, to give it a name, a cause. They would not find one. This was not a weather pattern. It was an axiom. The university campus was a collection of old brick buildings, sprawled under a sky that was now a hard, pale blue. The air was noticeably colder here than it should have been for the season. The silence from the coast was propagating, a subtle pressure drop that was preceding her arrival. She parked and walked. A student again in appearance, her backpack slung over one shoulder. No one looked at her twice. They were too busy, their minds buzzing with deadlines and social anxieties, the static of insignificant lives. Her destination was not a lecture hall, but a specific laboratory. The Advanced Thermodynamics Lab at Dutch. She had read their papers during her own studies. They were close, in their own clumsy way, to understanding the principles she now served. They sought to contain cold, to isolate it in magnetic bottles. They wanted to use it. They did not understand that it could not be used. It could only be. The lab door was unlocked. Inside, a graduate student was hunched over a monitor, his back to her. The room was dominated by a large, cylindrical chamber wrapped in superconducting coils. It was their prize, their attempt to create a stable, self-sustaining field of near absolute zero. A pathetic, guttering candle compared to the sun of silence she carried within her. He heard her and turned, his eyes bleary behind his glasses. "Can I help you? This is a restricted lab." Anya did not answer. She looked past him, at the machine. She could feel its struggle, the frantic, magnetic whine as it fought to contain the tiny point of cold within it. It was a bird in a cage, beating its wings against the bars. She could set it free. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the student said, standing up, his annoyance a puff of warm air in the cooling room. Anya walked toward the chamber. She ignored the young man, his presence as irrelevant as dust. She placed her hand on the cold, polished steel of the cylinder. The student rushed forward, his hand grabbing her shoulder. "What are you doing? You'll contaminate the..." His words turned into a gasp. His grip on her shoulder tightened for a second, then froze. The warmth of his hand was an insult, a stain. The cold did not flow from her this time. It simply was. It recognized a sympathetic point, a place already yearning for stillness. The magnetic containment field did not fail. It was fulfilled. The cold within the chamber accepted the cold she offered, and in that moment of recognition, the boundary between them ceased to exist. The wave of absolute zero bloomed outwards from the cylinder, not as a shock wave, but as a sudden, profound truth. The air in the room crystallized in an instant. The student was a statue, his face locked in an expression of shock, a fine rime of frost glazing his glasses. The hum of the lights, the whir of the computers, the frantic electrical buzz of the campus outside, all of it was swallowed by a deep, ringing quiet. Anya lowered her hand. The laboratory was perfect. A still life of pure potential. The custodian did not need to manifest here. Its essence was in the air, in the very atoms that had now ceased their jostling. She had not brought the silence. She had simply shown it a place where it was welcome, and it had come home. She left the lab, closing the door softly behind her. The hallway was still warm, still noisy with the distant sounds of a world not yet corrected. It was a temporary state. The silence was not just spreading. It was learning. It was finding its own pathways, its own methods. She was the catalyst, but the reaction was now self-sustaining. She walked out of the building and across the campus green. Students hurried past, laughing, their breath pluming in the unnaturally cold air. They didn't understand. They were living in the last moments of a dream. Anya reached her car. The map in her mind was shifting, not to a single point, but to a web, a network of cold logic that was beginning to think for itself. Her work as an apostle was evolving. Soon, she would not need to go to the noise. The silence would know where to find it. Story 2. The hallway leading to my bedroom was never the same length twice. I first noticed it on a Tuesday, I think, though time has a way of becoming soft and indistinct when the foundations of your world begin to warp. I had lived in my grandfather's old Victorian house on the edge of the salt marshes for 6 months, and for the first 5, the hallway was a constant. 12 paces from the top of the stairs to my door, the worn Persian runner, a river of burgundy and indigo guiding the way. Then that Tuesday, it was a canyon. My feet seemed to stick to the floorboards as I walked, the distance stretching, the door at the end receding like a taunt. The air grew thick and cold, and the only sound was the frantic thumping in my own chest. I had to press a hand against the floral-papered wall to steady myself, my palm registering the subtle, nauseating pulse of the wood beneath. Then, as suddenly as it had expanded, it contracted. I took one more step, and my doorknob was right there, cool and solid against my sweating forehead. I told myself it was fatigue, a trick of the moonlight filtering through the window at the hall's end, but the seed of unease was planted, a tiny black thing nestled deep in my gut. My name is Dashiell. I was 22 then, and blessed, or so everyone told me, with a face and form that opened doors. My beauty was not a subtle thing. It was a weapon, a key, a shield. I could feel its effect in a room, a shift in the atmosphere, a collective intake of breath. People wanted to be near me, to please me, to possess a piece of that light. I cultivated it, of course. It was my inheritance, more valuable than the crumbling house I now inhabited. I'd had a smile that could disarm a king, and a laugh that made others feel they were in on a wonderful secret. I believed, with the unshakable arrogance of youth, that this was the natural order of things. The change in the house began to feel less like a malfunction and more like a symptom. The proportions would shift, not just in the hallway, but in the rooms themselves. The parlor would sometimes feel vast and echoing, a ballroom for ghosts, and at other times it would press in on me, the ceiling low, the walls close enough to touch with outstretched arms. The air would carry the scent of salt and decay from the marshes, a smell I usually associated with the breeze, but now it seemed to emanate from the very plaster, a sweet, rotten breath. I started sleeping with the lights on. It was Jonah who gave a name to the feeling. Jonah, with his cynical smile and eyes that had seen too much of everything. He was a decade older, a painter of some renown in certain decadent circles, and he had attached himself to me shortly after I moved to town. He was my mentor in the art of indulgence. "You're feeling the weight of your own potential, Dashiell," he said one evening, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass. We were in the parlor, and for the moment, it was its normal, cluttered self. "This house, this life, it's too small for a spirit like yours. You are a god in waiting, and gods chafe against mortal constraints." The hallway got longer, I said, the confession sounding childish even to my own ears. "Did it?" He didn't laugh. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Or did you become more aware of the space you truly occupy? Reality is a suggestion, my boy. A consensus agreed upon by the dull and the blind. You are neither. You are beginning to see the seams." He was the one who proposed the portrait. "I want to capture you," he said. "Not the you that everyone sees. That's just a photograph. I want to capture the you that is emerging. The magnificent, terrible potential. A testament to your true self." The idea was intoxicating. A portrait by the infamous Jonah would cement my legend. It would be a thing of beauty, yes, but also of power. I agreed instantly. The sittings began in the attic, a space Jonah insisted was perfect for its light and its isolation. He had cleared a space, setting up his easel and a worn velvet chair for me to pose in. The large covered canvas stood nearby like a silent accomplice. The first time I climbed the stairs to the attic, I felt that same spatial disorientation. The room seemed to stretch into a shadowy infinity, the peaked roof lost in gloom. The air was chill and still, smelling of dust and, faintly, of turpentine and ozone. Ari, my oldest friend, hated the whole idea. Ari, whose face was kind and plain, whose morality was as solid and unshakable as oak. He visited one afternoon, his brow furrowed as he looked from me to Jonah, and back to the covered canvas. "This feels wrong, Dash," he said later, when we were alone downstairs. The hallway, mercifully, was its proper length. There's something predatory about him. And this house, it doesn't feel good anymore. It feels sick. "You're being dramatic," I said, brushing a piece of lint from my perfect sleeve. "Jonah is an artist. He's eccentric, and the house is just old." "It's not the age," Ari insisted, his voice low and earnest. "It's a feeling, like something is watching. And this portrait, it's vanity, Dash, a dangerous kind. It's like you're inviting something in." I dismissed him, of course. Ari's world was one of simple truths and black and white morality. He couldn't understand the glorious shades of gray I was learning to paint with Jonah. Then there was Bridget. She worked at the little bookshop in town. A girl with hair the color of wheat and eyes the color of a summer sky. She was innocence itself, a fresh bloom in a world I was learning to see as corrupt and fascinating. I pursued her not out of love, but out of a kind of nostalgic curiosity. She was a relic of a world I was leaving behind, and I wanted to possess that feeling before it was gone forever. I was charming. I was beautiful, and she never stood a chance. I would whisper sweet lies to her, watching the trust bloom in her eyes and feel a thrilling, cold power. When I grew bored, I would be cruel, picking apart her dreams with a surgeon's precision, just to see the light in her eyes flicker and dim. It was a game, and Jonah applauded my performance. "To feel nothing," he would say. "That is true power. To use others as instruments for your own pleasure. That is the mark of a higher being." The sittings continued. I would pose for hours in the attic, which now always felt vast and cold, no matter the weather outside. Jonah would work in silence, his brushstrokes swift and sure. He never let me see the work in progress. "It's not ready," he would say, a strange smile playing on his lips. "The transformation is not complete," and I felt myself changing, not just in spirit, but in body. I began to feel a strange detachment from my own reflection. The face in the mirror was still perfect, unlined, but it felt like a mask. A pleasant, empty shell. I started having dreams, vague and blurred at the edges, of another face lurking just beneath my skin. A visage of sagging flesh and malevolent eyes. I would wake with a start, the taste of copper in my mouth, the smell of the marsh, thick and cloying, filling the room. The small corruptions of my life began to feel insignificant. I needed more. I sought out darker pleasures, deeper degradations. I lied. I stole small, precious things from people who trusted me. Not for the value, but for the secret thrill of it. I broke Bridget's heart with a casual, calculated finality, watching her weep with a cold, clinical interest. The pain of others was like a drug, and I needed ever-increasing doses. Through it all, my reflection remained stubbornly, mockingly beautiful. But I started to feel a hollowness behind my eyes, a creeping fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. I was pouring my soul into some unseen vessel, and I was running dry. One night, I confronted Jonah. We were drinking his expensive whiskey, and the house was particularly unstable, the walls of the study seeming to breathe. "When will the portrait be finished?" I demanded, my voice slurred. "Soon," he purred. "It is becoming magnificent. It bears all the weight you are so wisely shedding. Every sin, every cruel thought, every drop of decay. The painting is absorbing it all. You are becoming pure Dashiell, a perfect, untouchable engine of will. The portrait is the scapegoat, the vessel for your..." The revelation should have horrified me. Instead, a profound, dark relief washed over me. So that was the secret. My beauty, my youth, would be preserved forever. The portrait would age, would corrupt, would bear the scars of my choices, and I would remain untouched. It was the ultimate deal. I drank to it. The final sitting arrived on a night when the fog from the marshes clung to the house like a shroud. The attic was colder than ever, the darkness beyond the single lit lamp feeling solid. Hungry. Jonah stood before the canvas, his face pale and ecstatic. "It is done," he whispered. "The masterpiece of my life." He stepped aside. I looked, and I screamed. The thing on the canvas was not a man. It was a corruption given form. It had my general features, the same arch of the brow, the same curve of the lip, but it was a monstrous caricature. The skin was sallow and sagging, webbed with a map of broken capillaries and deep lines gouged by cruelty. The eyes were the worst. They were mine in shape and color, but they held a depth of soulless, gleeful malice that made my blood freeze. They seemed to look directly at me, to know me. The mouth was twisted into a subtle, knowing sneer, the lips wet and faintly crimson, as if freshly stained. It was not an image of age, but of evil. It was every whispered lie, every act of casual cruelty, every drop of poison I had ever spilled, given a face. This was the scapegoat. This was the true cost of my choices. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jonah breathed. "It is your immortal soul, Dashiell, or what's left of it." I stumbled back, away from the horrific image. "Destroy it!" I shrieked. "Burn it!" "I can't," Jonah said, and for the first time, I heard a thread of fear in his voice. "It doesn't belong to me. It never did. It was always for you." I fled the attic. I ran down the stairs, the hallway below stretching and twisting, the walls pulsing as if with a diseased heart. I locked myself in my bedroom, but I could still feel the portrait's gaze through the floorboards, through the walls, a vile pressure against my skin. The days that followed were a blur of terror. I avoided the attic, but the house was no longer a sanctuary. The shifting proportions became more violent, more frequent. Doors would lead to the wrong rooms. Windows would look out onto a different time of day. I saw things in the periphery of my vision. A flicker of that sagging face in a dark window. A hint of that sneer in a tarnished silver spoon. I sought out Bridget to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, thinking perhaps some act of penance could reverse the process. I found her in the bookshop, but when she looked at me, her eyes were not full of hurt or anger. They were full of a cold, flat emptiness. "You," she said, her voice devoid of all feeling. "You are nothing. Just a pretty shell." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was nothing. I had traded my substance for a surface. I went to Ari's house, pounding on his door in the middle of the night. When he opened it, his face was grim. "Ari, you were right," I babbled, tears streaming down my face. "The portrait, it's me. My soul is in that thing. You have to help me destroy it." He looked at me for a long time, his kind eyes filled with a pity that was worse than hatred. "I can't let you in, Dashiell." "What? Why?" "I need your help." "Because you're not Dashiell," he said softly, and closed the door. I heard the lock turn. I stood there on his porch, the truth crashing down on me. I was the shell, the beautiful, empty vessel. The real me, the sum of my choices, was up in the attic, trapped in oil and canvas, growing more vile and powerful with every passing second. I returned to the house, a ghost in my own life. I had no choice. It was the only place left for me. I climbed the stairs to the attic, each step in agony. The door was ajar. I pushed it open. The room was still. The air was cold and dead. The portrait stood on its easel, uncovered. The face within was even more hideously detailed than I remembered, the eyes now seeming to glow with a faint infernal light. It was more real than I was. I walked towards it, drawn by a force I could not resist. I stood before it, our faces inches apart. "Take it back," I whispered to the painted thing. "Please, take it all back." The painted lips did not move, but a voice, my voice, corrupted and thick with phlegm, echoed in the silent attic, not through the air but inside my own skull. "I already have." A wave of absolute nothingness washed over me. All feeling, all memory, all desire simply ceased. I was a beautiful, perfect, hollow thing. I turned and walked down from the attic. The hallway was its proper length. The house was quiet. The distortions had stopped. Everything was still. I went to the mirror in the hall and looked at my reflection. It was flawless. The most beautiful face I had ever seen. I felt nothing about it. It was just a fact, like the color of the wall, or the time of day. I live here still. The portrait remains in the attic. I never go up there. There is no need. Sometimes people visit. Jonah came once, his face pale with a fear he could not name. He looked at me, tried to speak, then fled, and never returned. Ari checks on me occasionally, standing on the porch, never crossing the threshold. He looks at me with that same deep pity, and I feel nothing. I am Dashel. I am 22. I am beautiful. The world is a series of simple, uninteresting facts. The house is just a house. The hallway is always 12 paces long, and the face in the mirror is my own. There is no horror here. There is no story. There is only the quiet, the stillness, and the perfect, unending silence of a life that has been completely and utterly vacated. The silence is the only thing that is truly mine. It fills the rooms, a palpable presence thicker than the marsh fog. I exist within it, a curator of an empty museum. The days pass in a bland procession, one indistinguishable from the next. I eat when I remember, sleep when my body demands it, but these are mechanical processes, devoid of sensation or need. Food has no taste. Sleep brings no dreams, only a brief cessation of awareness. I spend most of my time in the parlor, sitting in a high-backed chair, watching the light move across the floor. I do not read. I do not think. I simply am. The world outside the windows is a painting, flat and unconvincing. People move through it, but they are like shadows. Their lives and dramas having no more substance to me than the flicker of a moth against the glass. Bridget came to the door once. I saw her through the sidelight, her wheat-colored hair pulled back, her face thinner, older. She stood there for a long time, her hand raised as if to knock, but she never did. She just looked at the house, her expression a complex tapestry of sorrow and resolve that I observed with the same detached interest I would give to a crack in the plaster. Then she turned and walked away, back into a world that no longer concerned me. The mail piles up on the floor inside the front door. Bills, mostly. They mean nothing. The electricity was shut off weeks ago. The water, too. It makes no difference. The house is cold, but I do not feel the cold. The house is dark when the sun goes down, but I do not fear the dark. There is nothing in the darkness that is not already in me. Or rather, nothing that is still in me. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, a sound will drift down from the attic. It is not a footstep or a voice. It is a low, soft, wet sound, like a brush being dragged through a pot of thick, clotted paint. It is the sound of the portrait, breathing, or dreaming. Or perhaps it is simply the sound of my own discarded life, settling. I hear it, and I feel nothing. It is just another fact of the house. This morning, I was in the hall, looking at nothing in particular, when I noticed a change. A small dark spot on the floral wallpaper just beside my bedroom door. I reached out and touched it. It was damp. I brought my finger to my nose. The smell was unmistakable. The thick, sweet, rotten scent of the salt marsh. It was weeping. The house was weeping for me, or for what I had been. I went to the mirror then, as I often do, not out of vanity, but out of a formless, habitual checking. The face was still there, perfect and unchanging, but as I watched, a single glistening track of moisture welled up in the corner of my left eye. It trembled for a moment on the edge of my lashes, a perfect, liquid diamond. I felt no sadness, no grief, no emotion at all to prompt it. It was simply happening, a biological anomaly. The tear traced a path down the flawless plane of my cheek, and I watched its journey in the glass, fascinated by its slow, inevitable progress. It did not feel like my tear. It felt like something from outside, a memory of rain. When it reached my jawline, it hung there for a second before falling, disappearing into the collar of my shirt. I looked away from the mirror and back at the damp spot on the wall. The silence in the house felt different then. Not empty, but waiting. The tear had been a message, a signal from a country to which I no longer belonged. It was a reminder that the portrait was not just a painting. It was a reservoir, and it was full. And reservoirs eventually must overflow. I turned from the mirror and walked back to my chair in the parlor. I sat down. The silence closed in around me once more. But it was no longer a comfort. It was a held breath. And I knew, with a certainty as cold and flat as the surface of a mirror, that the story was not over. It was simply waiting for its true protagonist to decide what to do next. The next day, a man came to the door. He was a census taker, he said, his voice a dry rustle through the heavy wood. I did not answer. He knocked again, persistent. I remained in my chair, a statue in the parlor's gloom. I heard the scrape of the mail slot opening, and a folded leaflet fluttered to the floor. Then, a sharp intake of breath. I turned my head just enough to see him through the window. He was staring not at the house, but at his own hand, which he had pulled back from the mail slot. A dark, viscous smudge stained his fingers. He brought them to his nose, his face contorting in disgust at the marsh scent I knew so well. He looked up, and for a fleeting second our eyes met through the glass. His were wide with a primal, uncomprehending fear. He did not see a beautiful young man in a house. He saw something else entirely. He fled, leaving the leaflet on the floor. That night, the sounds from the attic changed. The wet brushing sound was joined by another, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was the sound of a fingernail, testing the canvas from the inside. Tap, dot, tap, dot, tap, dot. It was not loud, but it was insistent, a patient and deliberate percussion against the fabric of my silence. I sat in my chair and listened. I felt the vibration of it in the floorboards, a tiny, invasive pulse. I looked at my own hands, resting on the arms of the chair. They were clean, the nails perfectly shaped. The tapping was not coming from me. The following afternoon, a different kind of visitor arrived. It was a young couple new to the area, drawn by the house's imposing grandeur and its low, forgotten price. They let themselves through the creaking garden gate, their voices bright and hopeful. I watched them from the parlor window. The woman pointed to the peeling paint, talking about potential. The man laughed, a sound that was jarringly alive. Then the woman stopped. She was looking at the attic window. Her smile faded. She clutched the man's arm. I followed her gaze. The attic window was dark, but for a moment I saw it too. A pale, bloated face pressed against the glass from within, its eyes dark pools of stagnant water. It was there, and then It was gone. The couple did not speak another word. They backed away, their earlier hope replaced by a unified, unspoken dread, and hurried down the path. I turned from the window. The tapping in the attic had stopped. The silence that replaced it was different. It was the silence of satisfaction. The portrait had shown itself. It was no longer content to be a secret. It wanted to be seen. That was when I felt the first true sensation in months. It was not an emotion. It was a physical pull, a subtle magnetic draw towards the staircase. My feet, which had been rooted to this sterile existence, felt a sudden, terrible lightness. The compulsion was not my own. It was an invitation, or a summons. I rose from my chair. The air in the hall was cold and heavy with the smell of decaying reeds. I did not want to go upstairs, but my will was no longer my own, if it ever had been. I was a hollow bone, and a force was blowing through me. I placed my hand on the banister. The wood was damp, sweating that same foul moisture. I began to climb. Each step was an effort, as if I were moving against a strong current. The hallway below seemed to stretch away, the front door receding into a pinprick of light. The attic door at the top of the stairs was no longer ajar. It was open wide. A deep, amber glow spilled out, not the cold light of day, but the warm, sickly light of old varnish and dried blood. I stood on the threshold. The tapping started again, slow and deliberate, a mockery of a heartbeat. I could see the back of the canvas on its easel, and the glow was emanating from the painting itself. It was lit from within. A voice, my corrupted voice, did not speak in my mind this time. It came from the room itself, a physical vibration in the air. "Come in," it said. "It is time we spoke face to face." I crossed the threshold. The air in the attic was no longer cold and dead. It was warm and humid, thick with the fecund smell of the marsh and something else, something metallic and old, like spilled blood. The single lamp was unlit, but the painting provided its own illumination, a hellish, internal radiance that pushed back the shadows and painted the room in shades of jaundice and rust. The portrait was more hideously vibrant than ever. The sallow skin seemed to pulse with a sluggish life. The eyes, those pools of malicious intelligence, were fixed on me. They were no longer just painted. They were windows, and something looked out from them. The sneer on the lips was a little wider, a little more possessive. "Sit," the voice said, and I realized it was not coming from the air, but from the painted mouth itself. The lips did not move in any human sense, but the shape of the sneer shifted minutely to form the word. There was a stool before the easel, one I had used during the sittings. I sat. I had no choice. My body was a puppet, and the thing in the frame held the strings. "You've been comfortable?" it asked, the voice a wet gurgle, as if spoken through a throat full of mud. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. "This silence," it continued, "this emptiness, it is a luxury I never had. I have known only the noise, the glorious, screaming noise of every choice you ever made, the thrill of the lie, the exquisite pain of the betrayal. I have feasted on it all." A painted tongue, black and swollen, flicked out to wet the crimson lips. But a feast must be shared. A vessel, once full, must be poured. I felt a cold dread then, not for myself, but for the pristine nothingness that was my existence. It was about to be violated. "You thought you were free," the portrait hissed. "You thought you had traded your dross for purity. But you are the frame, Dashiell. I am the art, and a frame exists to display the art. It is time for the world to see what we have made." The compulsion shifted. It was no longer a pull to sit, but a command to act. My right hand lifted, seemingly of its own volition. It reached out, not towards the painting, but towards the wall beside the easel, where a long, rusty nail protruded from a beam. My fingers closed around it. The metal was cold and rough. "The world needs a reminder," the portrait whispered, its glee palpable. "It has forgotten the taste of true corruption. It dabbles in petty sins. We will show them magnificence." My hand, holding the nail, moved towards the canvas. I tried to resist, to let go, but my muscles were no longer mine. I was a spectator in my own body. "Not me, you fool," the thing sneered. "The frame is of no consequence. The message is everything. Take our message into the world. Let it begin." My hand stopped its advance towards the painting. It turned, slowly, inevitably. The point of the nail, sharp and cruel, was now aimed directly at the palm of my other hand, which lay open and helpless on my knee. A beginning. The portrait breathed, its light intensifying, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like reaching claws. A small, precious thing, and with a force that was not my own, my hand brought the nail down. The pain was a distant, theoretical thing. I watched, fascinated, as the rusty point pierced the perfect, unblemished skin of my palm. There was a resistance, then a pop, and then the nail was buried deep in my flesh. A single dark bead of blood welled up around the wound, stark against the porcelain white. It did not look like my blood. It looked like paint. My hand released the nail, leaving it jutting obscenely from my palm. I felt no agony, only a profound sense of violation, not of my body, but of the beautiful, empty shell I had become. The silence was broken. The stillness was shattered. "Good," the portrait gurgled, its satisfaction of physical pressure in the room. "Now, go. Walk among them. Let it fester. Let them see that the rot is not in the house or the portrait. The rot is in you. It always was." I stood, my movements jerky, like a marionette. I turned from the easel, the nail in my hand a grotesque new appendage. I walked back towards the attic door, each step sending a dull, metallic throb up my arm. The blood began to flow more freely now, a slow, steady drip that pattered onto the dusty floorboards, leaving a trail of dark blossoms behind me. I descended the stairs. The hallway was no longer 12 paces long. It stretched for what seemed like a mile, the walls pulsing softly, the floral pattern on the wallpaper shifting, the roses looking more like open, bleeding wounds. The smell of the marsh was overpowering, clinging to my clothes, my hair. I reached the front door. My hand, the uninjured one, reached for the knob. It was cold. I had not opened this door in months. I turned it and pulled. The daylight was a dull, gray shock. I stepped out onto the porch. The air outside was different. It was heavy, charged, as if before a storm. I looked down at my hand. The nail was still there. A stark, brutal fact. The blood had soaked the cuff of my white shirt, a spreading stain of rust and crimson. I walked down the path and into the street. The first person I saw was Mrs. Higgins from 2 houses down, walking her small, yapping dog. She saw me, offered a tentative, neighborly smile, and then her eyes dropped to my hand. Her smile froze, then shattered. Her face went slack with horror. The dog whimpered and cowered. She turned and scurried away, pulling the animal behind her. I kept walking. I had no destination. I was the message, and the message was simply to be seen. I walked towards the center of town. People stopped. They stared. They pointed. Some crossed the street to avoid me. Their faces were a gallery of revulsion and fear. They did not see the beautiful Dashiell anymore. They saw the nail. They saw the blood. They saw the emptiness in my eyes. and they recognized it for what it was. They saw the portrait's work. I found myself standing outside the bookshop. The windows were clean, the displays tidy. Through the glass, I saw Bridget at the counter, helping a customer. She looked up. Our eyes met. She did not look away in fear or pity. She looked at the nail in my hand, at the blood, at the hollow man I had become. And in her eyes, I saw a terrible, grim understanding. She had always seen the potential for this. She had seen the rot before I'd even begun to paint. She did not scream or run. She simply held my gaze for a long, silent moment, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation. The portrait was right. This was only the beginning. The frame was now on display, and the art within was starting to seep out. I turned from the bookshop and continued my walk, a slow, bleeding procession, through a world that was no longer flat and unconvincing, but was now sharp, real, and utterly terrified of what I had become. The blood was a steady rhythm now, each drop hitting the pavement with a soft, final tap. It was the only sound I heard, a private metronome keeping time with my slow, deliberate steps. The rest of the world had become a silent film of panicked faces and hurried retreats. Cars slowed, their drivers' eyes wide behind glass, then accelerated away. A child pointed and was swiftly hushed and pulled inside a doorway. I was a plague ship sailing through the main street, and the nail was my flag. I did not feel the pain. I felt the gaze. It was no longer just the eyes of the townspeople upon me. It was the portrait's gaze seeing through my own eyes, tasting the fear I left in my wake. It fed on this spectacle. And with every horrified reaction, I felt a little less substantial, a little more like a pane of glass through which a monstrous light was shining. I found myself at the edge of the salt marsh. The path was familiar, the one I had walked so many times in my previous life, seeking inspiration in the decay. The wooden boardwalk was slick with mist and age. My shoes made a hollow sound on the planks. The reeds stood tall and brittle, their whispers a sibilant chorus. The smell here was the same as the smell in my house, in my hand. Thick, sweet, and final. I walked until the boardwalk ended, giving way to a small, unstable-looking platform that jutted out over the black water. This was the place. This was where I had come to dream of a life free from consequence, and where I had ultimately made the bargain that had led me here. I looked down at the water. It was still, a dark mirror reflecting the low gray sky. My reflection stared back, pale and gaunt, a nail driven through its hand. But as I watched, the reflection began to change. The features softened, blurred, and then resolved into another face altogether. The face from the attic, the sallow, bloated visage of the portrait. It stared up at me from the depths, its sneer a black slash in the water. A command, not in words, but in pure, undeniable intent, filled my mind. It was a single, clear instruction. I raised my injured hand. The nail caught the flat light, a dull gleam of metal and clotted blood. With my other hand, I grasped the head of the nail. There was no thought of resistance. I was the instrument. I pulled. It came out with a sickening, wet suck, the sound of a root being pulled from deep, wet earth. A fresh, dark stream of blood poured from the wound, splashing onto the platform and into the water below. The reflection in the water smiled, a ripple of pure pleasure distorting its features. Now, it seemed to say, now we are truly joined. The pain arrived then, not as a sharp, localized agony, but as a wave of pure sensation that broke over the numb shores of my being. It was immense and clarifying. It was the pain of the lie made real, the betrayal made physical. It was the price, finally being paid. I did not drop the nail. My fingers closed around it, the metal warm and slick with my own blood. The world swam. The gray sky and the black water merging into a single swirling darkness. The last thing I saw was my reflection in the water, my own face once more, but twisted into the portrait's perfect, knowing sneer. Then my knees buckled, and the marsh rose up to claim me. The water was cold, a shock that was almost a relief after the suffocating warmth of the house. Closed over my head, and the silence returned, not as an absence, but as a presence, deep and dark and complete. It was the silence of the portrait's satisfaction. The message had been delivered. The story was now in the soil. The first thing I was aware of was the cold. It was a deep, marrow-numbing cold that had nothing to do with the water. It was the cold of the void I had so carefully cultivated, now flooded with a brutal physical reality. I was lying on my back on the wooden platform, coughing up brackish water that burned my throat. I had not drowned. I was not meant to drown. The fall, the shock. It was all part of the display. I pushed myself up onto my elbows. The world was muted, the colors washed out as if I were looking through a pane of smoked glass. My left hand was a ruin. The puncture was a dark, ugly mouth, and the blood still flowed, slower now, a thick, syrupy trickle that matted the splintered wood beneath me. The nail was still clutched in my right fist, a cold, hard truth. I stood, my body aching and heavy, my clothes soaked through and clinging to my skin like a second, dead layer. The walk back into town was a blur. The streets were emptier now, or perhaps people were simply hiding behind their curtains, watching the specter of Dashiell Holt shamble through their tidy world. I was no longer a man. I was an event, a rumor given flesh and blood. I reached my house. The garden gate hung open, swaying slightly in the wind. The front door was still ajar, just as I had left it. I stepped inside. The parlor was exactly as I had abandoned it. The chair, the silence, the leaflet from the census taker still on the floor. But it was all different. The silence was no longer mine. It was a listening silence. The house was waiting. I did not go to the attic. I did not need to. I could feel the portrait's consciousness draped over everything. A spider web of malevolent attention. It was pleased. The frame had been presented. The art had been acknowledged. I walked into the kitchen. The sink was dry and dusty. I turned the faucet. Rusty water coughed and sputtered, then ran in a thin brown stream. I held my wounded hand under it. The water swirled pink in the basin, but the wound did not clean. It looked older, as if the flesh around the puncture was already beginning to necrotize, tinged with a greenish-black bruise. The smell that rose from it was unmistakably that of the marsh, of the portrait. I wrapped my hand in a clean dish towel, the white linen quickly blooming with a dark, Rorschach-like stain. The nail I placed on the kitchen table. It sat there, a stark, brutal object on the scrubbed wood. For days, I did not leave. The wound did not heal. It wept a constant, thin ooze that stained everything it touched. The smell of decay began to permeate the house, a companion scent to the marsh's perfume. I would sit in my chair and watch the door, waiting. I did not know what I was waiting for. A sign. An end. It came on a Thursday, a sharp official rap on the door. Not the timid knock of a neighbor or the curious tap of a stranger. This was the sound of authority. I did not answer. The knocking came again, more insistent. "Mr. Holt, this is the police." I remained still, a statue in a tomb. I heard the creak of the door being pushed fully open. Footsteps, 2 sets, heavy and cautious, entered my hall. They stopped at the parlor entrance. "Jesus," one of them whispered. They saw me in the chair. They saw the pallor of my skin, the hollows of my eyes, the way I seemed to be more a part of the house of gloom than a live-in occupant. And then their eyes fell to my hand, the stained towel a glaring admission of guilt. "Mr. Holt," the older one said, his voice carefully neutral, "we've had reports concerning your well-being, and some concerning behavior." I said nothing. I just looked at him. "We need you to come with us, sir," the younger one said, his voice tighter, edged with a nervousness he was trying to suppress. The older officer's gaze swept the room, taking in the dust, the stillness, and finally, landing on the kitchen table, visible through the open door. His eyes fixed on the nail. "What happened to your hand, Mr. Holt?" he asked, his tone dropping, becoming more serious. That was when the sound started again from the attic. Not a tap. A long, slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Both officers flinched, their hands going instinctively to their belts. "What was that?" the younger one demanded, his head snapping towards the ceiling. The older officer looked from the attic to the nail on the table, to my ruined hand. His face hardened with a dawning, horrible comprehension. He wasn't seeing a sick man. He was seeing a crime scene. "I think you'd better come with us now, sir," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We can get that hand looked at." I stood. It was not my decision. It was the next step. As I moved towards them, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of the parlor window. I was not there. In my place, for a fleeting instant, stood the figure from the portrait, its sneer a promise of things to come. Then it was gone, and I was just a man with a wounded hand, being led away by the police. The house watched us go, its silence now a smug, satisfied thing. The story was no longer in the attic. It was walking out into the world, wearing my skin.